Scripture today is Luke 24, verses 13 to 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
I'm a big fan of Douglas Adams. As some of you might remember, I've mentioned him before a few times, and I quote him occasionally. Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and created the holistic detective Dirk Gently, amongst other things. He wrote in the guide once that flying is easy. Flying is easy. All you have to do is throw yourself at the ground and miss. Think about it for a second. If you threw yourself at the ground and you missed, where would you be? You could say you were levitating or, suspended, or you were hovering or whatever, but you'd be flying, wouldn't you? If you could throw yourself at the ground and miss. Who wants to try it? Do you want to try it? Anybody? Okay, hold that thought for a second. I'm going to amaze you in a minute. But it makes perfect sense. If you missed the ground, you would be flying. You would, if you could miss the ground. But, of course, right away you're going to go, yes, but you can't, because we have this little thing called gravity that draws you to the ground, and you couldn't possibly throw yourself at the ground and miss. Again, hold that thought. I'm going to amaze you in a second. But then you might think, okay, what if there was no gravity? Then you could definitely throw yourself at the ground and miss, right? Yeah, except we'd all be floating around. It wouldn't be a big deal, would it? We'd all be doing it. In fact, the real trick would be to attach yourself to the ground and walk around. It'd be the opposite. So, who wants to try throwing themselves at the ground and missing? Anybody? You don't believe it can be done? Excuse me. Really? Okay, watch this. Yeah, I can't do it. Of course I can't do it. There's gravity. I'm going to hit the ground. I'm going to hurt myself. I learned that after 10 tries. But still, if you could, it'd be amazing, wouldn't it? It'd be amazing. You'd be like completely amazed because it can't be done. Science says you can't do that. So how on earth are you going to believe that Jesus is alive? Science says that can't happen. How could Jesus possibly be alive? You're not alone in your thinking, and not just because a fairly significant percentage of Canadians don't believe that God exists or anything, but because characters in the Bible story don't believe it either. From the very beginning of the Easter story, people don't believe it. The women who went to the tomb didn't believe it. The disciples they told didn't believe it. Thomas didn't believe it. They didn't believe it until they actually saw Jesus. And then they expected to be able to go and tell people and have people believe them. Good luck with that, right? And yet, but here's this story today. Here's this story that encompasses all of this. All of this. Because this is a story about two disciples who recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Jesus did something that Jesus does, and they saw him do it, and they suddenly realized it was Jesus. Because Jesus did exactly what they expected Jesus would do. Which is really kind of sad, because he'd been doing it for the entire time they were walking down the road. It would be really easy to dismiss this as, of course, the disciples didn't recognize Jesus. Maybe he was wearing glasses. Who knows? But of course the disciples wouldn't recognize Jesus because they didn't believe either. It'd be really easy to say, just like when you go into a store, you're walking down the street and you suddenly see somebody, you haven't seen them for 20 years, you didn't expect to see them there. Do you recognize them right away? No, it's, right? It's no wonder they didn't recognize Jesus. He was dead. But dead is dead. That's why they didn't recognize him. How can he be alive? Are we expected to believe that Jesus violates a fundamental principle which guides all of our existence? Yes, you know it is. You know it is. Death guides our existence. Think about how sad that is for a minute. But it is true. It's the one, well, with taxes, right? It's the one thing that's a certainty in life. Death and taxes. The one certainty. It's no wonder they didn't believe Jesus was alive. Their focus was on death. So here they are walking down the road, and this stranger appears and starts walking down the road with them and is doing some really amazing Jesusing with them, and yet they did not recognize it was Jesus. They only recognized Jesus when Jesus did something that they thought Jesus should do. At which point, they suddenly realized how they had felt walking down the street. So I hope, I know I'm always doing this because, the story ends this way and then I go, but I hope this is what happens after the story ends. But I hope that these two disciples then went around telling everyone, I can't believe we didn't know it was Jesus, because he was doing exactly what Jesus taught us to do. He was helping us understand stuff. He was helping us feel better about the world. He was helping us feel more positive about what we can do. He was being Jesus the whole time and we didn't recognize him. And those two disciples go around telling people, it's so important that you look for Jesus, that you be open, not just go looking thinking, oh, that must be Jesus because, he's breaking the bread the way Jesus does, but being open to people being Jesus who don't look like Jesus. People who not only don't look like Jesus, aren't supposed to. Because those are the people, remember, Jesus spent all the time with? Jesus was always hanging out with people you weren't supposed to hang out with. He's always making time for people who had been set apart, somehow marginalized from society. Are you open to seeing Jesus amongst people like that? Because if Jesus is in everybody, it's kind of like saying God loves everyone. It's either everyone or it's not everyone. And if you're prepared to say it's not everyone, by the way, then you are not a follower of Jesus, because Jesus loved everyone, loves everyone. So here they are walking down the road, and the stranger appears, and the stranger is doing, I'm going to use it again. Doing some really good Jesusing. Jesus is a verb. And yet they don't recognize it. Until he does something, they think Jesus ought to do. How different is that really from the other disciples? And remember, these two were not they're not of the 11, or 12, the 11, or the women who went to the tomb. They're not. You can tell because, first of all, at the end of the story, it says they go back and talk to the 11, but also because one of them gets a name, Cleopas. Whoever that is. There's lots of theories, by the way, about who Cleopas is, but it doesn't say who he is. And I think whoever told this story the first time probably told it as there were two disciples, and then Jesus appeared, and then blah, 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 and people went, oh, so who were the two disciples? Just any old two disciples? You didn't know who? Oh, okay. So if that person thought, hey, if I throw in a name they recognize, it gives it more credibility, right? So there were two disciples. One of them was Lori. One of them was Dwayne. One of them was Ken. One of them was Sybil. Whoever you're telling the story to, you throw in a name that they might recognize. Because then your story instantly has some credibility, right? Because one of those disciples is one of you. Yes, it is. Because so's the other one. Because the other one's you, right? The other one is you. We are these disciples. We have to be these disciples because, first of all, not only did we not believe that Jesus was alive, we failed to recognize somebody being Jesus as we walked down the road to Emmaus. Anybody know where Emmaus is? No, you don't, because nobody does, really, because there isn't one. In the biblical Emmaus, the guess is there's 9 places that we think is the biblical Emmaus, the actual physical location, based on the information we get in the story. There's 9 different places that people think it could be, but there isn't actually anywhere on the map that says it's Emmaus, and it's exactly the right distance. So basically, they were on the road to somewhere, but we're not really sure where. That sounds like us too, doesn't it? We're always talking about life's a journey. It's such a cliche. A journey to where? That's the part that's interesting. We don't really know. We're going somewhere, but we're not exactly sure. But we're going somewhere. So the disciples are us. We're walking down the road, and a stranger appears. Are you open to seeing that stranger is Jesus? Are you open to that stranger being you? Being Jesus? You know, it's funny. That was really funny about the Jesus glasses, right? But think about that. Think about that Superman Clark Kent thing. And there's actually a study to back up the idea that you're going to think this is ridiculous, but there's actually a study that backs up the idea that you don't necessarily always recognize somebody when they put on a pair of glasses. University of York did a study a few years ago in England where they had a test group, and they had a picture of somebody without wearing glasses that the person didn't know, and a picture of somebody wearing glasses. And 6% of the time, they didn't recognize the person with the glasses on, right? So there was a 6% difference. And I know you're thinking to yourself, that's nothing, and it isn't. Unless, of course, say you happen to be visually checking for facial recognition in airports around the world, because that means that 6% is like 6 million people in one airport alone over a year. Doesn't that make you nervous? Yeah, it probably should. But the point is that it doesn't always happen that you instantly recognize someone even if they have their glasses on. So look, Superman, Clark Kent, I know it's a story. Somebody made the story up. But basically, in one instance, it's a powerful figure wearing a costume. And in another circumstance, it's some guy in a suit with glasses on. See how easy it is to mistake that can't be the same person? It is easy. It's easy to assume that somebody who looks like they've been living on the street for a while and needs a bath can't be Jesus. It's easy to recognize that somebody who 5 minutes ago you saw being mean to somebody else couldn't then turn around and be Jesus to a different person. So that's a really hard one, don't you think? It's a really hard one. It's easy to go, somebody who's quite obviously marginalized in some way, they're poor or, due to health or any of those, the obvious people that Jesus picked out from amongst the marginalized. But don't you think Jesus also taught to people who were just not nice people? I think so. Because the potential for Jesus being in everybody means Jesus is in everybody, even somebody that you don't like. Not just for any of those obvious reasons, but somebody you just don't like. Either Jesus is in everybody or Jesus is not in everybody. Believe me, Jesus is in everybody. Absolutely, even you. I'm trying not to look at anyone individually as I say that. I'll just look around the room. It's true. The potential for Jesus is in absolutely everybody. And that means not only should we not embrace it and live it, we should also not ignore that potential in other people. This is what that's why this story is so great, is that, and by the way, it might have been made up. Because the idea of a stranger, meeting a stranger on a journey who enlightens you in some way, isn't new. The Romans had it long before this story appeared. There was a story about travelers on their way to Rome, and they meet Romulus, who's been dead for quite some time, who tells them all about how to build a great empire. And then, of course, the travelers go to Rome and turn Rome into a great empire, right? Romulus being one of the two founded, Romulus and Remus were the guys who founded Rome, according to the legend, right? There's other stories from other cultures that tell the story of people on a journey meeting a stranger who enlightens them in some way. So the story is not even particular to Christianity. But how amazing is this, that you'd be walking down the road and you'd meet somebody who turns out to be somebody who's been dead? Can you believe that? How can you? Dead is dead. So we're back at the throw yourself at the ground and miss thing. Right? We're conditioned to understand things on the basis of what we actually can really see and touch and do, and the science behind things. Dead is dead. Dead is dead. And yet, we're asked to believe that Jesus is alive. In this story, we're not only being asked to believe that Jesus is alive, because at the end of the story they recognize that it's Jesus being alive, but that he was the whole time that they didn't recognize that it was Jesus. In other words, the potential for Jesus to be alive in a stranger, in someone we don't recognize. How are you going to believe that? How are you going to believe that? Think about the first, very first people and this is going to happen in a few weeks, right? The whole ascension story, according to this, we get the whole 40 days after Easter thing and all that stuff. And so Jesus only hangs around for a while and then leaves permanently. Well, until the next time, right? But Jesus leaves. Think about how hard it was for those disciples to then go and tell people Jesus is alive. I'm sure everyone they said that to said, prove it. Literally everyone probably said, prove it. How would you move people to understand Jesus is alive? Can't be alive. I can prove it. I can prove he can't be alive. Throw yourself at the ground and miss. Go ahead, I dare you. It'd be totally awesome, by the way, if one of you were to actually do that and start flying. There's only one way. And that's to experience Jesus the way these two disciples experienced Jesus. On the road, in a stranger that they didn't recognize was Jesus. That's how we know Jesus is alive, is to experience Jesus, the verb. Can't do it. I was trying not to say Jesusing again, but if we're all Jesusing at the same time, you can't miss that Jesus is alive. You can't. It's easy. The hard part is when we're not. Or when we're not open to seeing Jesus. And that's hard. Because being open to seeing Jesus in another person is kind of like being open to getting to know someone for who they really are rather than who you think they ought to be ahead of time. And we're real good at that. We're real good at deciding how people should be. And then we're terribly disappointed when they're not, of course. So we try and fix them. But we're supposed to be open to getting to know each other for who we are, right? It's hard. Nobody's saying it's not hard, by the way, because it is. And I know that Bible stories make it sound really easy. Like, we're going to hear from Acts and everything about how all the disciples then went out and preached to everybody, and instantly entire nations of people threw themselves down and said, oh, I'm going to worship God now because Jesus lives. No, they didn't. The disciples had a hard time convincing people. But the people that they convinced changed things. They did, because knowing that Jesus is alive changes you. Because knowing that spirit of love and grace and everything is alive in you changes you. It moves you to share it with others. It moves you to try and see it in others. That's why this story is so valuable. The second half is just another, oh, look, it's Jesus, he's alive story. The first part of the story is, I don't know who you are, but gosh, you're an awful lot like Jesus. That's how we ought to be looking at everyone. That's how we ought to be trying to be with everyone. Sometimes Jesus has his glasses on. Sometimes. You got to look more closely.